Very good morning, ma'am, and a very warm regards. And I'm also grateful to you for giving me the second opportunity to present on the topic modernism and postmodernism. I would also be grateful to my all peer mates and close friends who would be listening me and who would be bearing with me for next 30 to 35 minutes around. The topic today we are going to deal is modernism and postmodernism. There are basically the topic which was assigned to me was this, but the topic which flows simultaneously with this topic is pre-modernism, modernism, and postmodernism. Fundamentally, these are three stages of evolution of jurisprudence, we can say law, and let me assure you that every stream has taken place in same shape and in same sequence and size. Either it is literature, either it is art, or something else. In some little earlier, in some little later, as literature in these three classifications took place little later in comparison when we compare it with law and jurisprudence. Before venturing into the question that what is modernism, pre-modernism, post-modernism, and lot more, we fundamentally and firstly need to understand that what this ism is. This is one of the most important doctrine, at least for 21st century. You would be listening lot many words where the suffix would be as ism. So ism is a philosophy. It is a doctrine type of thing. It is a suffix. It is a suffix of English, which is originally derived from a Greek word, ismos. It means taking side with or imitation of, and is often used to describe philosophical theories, theories of religion, social movement, artistic theories, and behaviors. The suffix ism is itself not biased. Suffix ism is a neutral, and therefore it bears no connotation associated with any of the many ideologies that ism identifies. Such determination can only be informed by public opinion regarding specific ideologies. Ism is fundamentally a dogma, a thought, an ideology, a philosophy that is prevailing. This particular word ism in its only common usage and uses is not very old. It was used as a suffix with various words, but the particularly word ism got used first time in around 18th century. So modernism and postmodernism are later stages. Before modernism and postmodernism, what was there is pre-modernism. As by very word, it is evident that something is modernism and there is another thing that is pre-modernism. So pre-modernism is the state which was before modernism. Pre-modernism in sense of law, for jurisprudence, for evolution of law, for critical thinking, it was the era before 17th century in Europe. Now, when I say before 17th century in Europe, what I mean is that 17th to 18th century was the time which was time of Enlightenment. And one more thing, let me make it very clear that when we discuss the evolution of law in this doctrine in sense of dates, in sense of centuries, then this is not strictly applicable for India. When we say that Europe went with Enlightenment during 17th, 18th century, then we are not considering it as universal phenomenon. We would say that India was far more enlightened during 17th century when we are comparing with European countries. Another thing is that when Europe was on its verge of enlightenment, when it was being said that the sun of East India Company never sets, during the time the Indian sun was dooming because it was under the colonial power. So pre-modernism is basically, it was a time period before 17th century. During the pre-modernist phase, God, faith, these dogmas were prevalent. Pre-modernism has stressed upon metaphysical unity of physical existence and principle governing the physical existence. Individual and society were considered the part of nature and divinity. Everything during the pre-modernist time was having its authority, its sanctity from God, from that universal power, from spirituality, from faith. Faith that was sometimes, better to say, most of the time was even blind. Therefore, truth and eternal values or universal principles could always be discerned by persons within themselves as they were participants in the divine order of nature. In the medieval era, these universal principles were supposed to be ordained by God. Man's reason were limited. We can say that man's reason were handicapped at that time. Every time when man was trying to think, when I say man, I equally encapsulate and imbibe all the gender and sexes of society. So the reason of man, women, and all the genders were getting paralyzed when it's come to rational thinking, when it's come to intelligence, because everything was having precedence of God over it, was having precedence of faith over things. That is why people were incapable of knowing the true nature of the universe and universal principles. Faith was now the best recourse for man, for anything and everything, and for man to live with peace in this universe. After pre-modernism, it was the time of post-modernism. But in the medieval era, during pre-modernism, universal principles were supposed to be ordained by God. Man's reason were highly limited, highly handicapped, incapable of knowing the true nature of universal principles. This was the time of pre-modernism. So we can assume, we can once re-venture through our minds and we can think that how European countries would be looking like at that time before the Enlightenment in Europe. When I say again that before the Enlightenment of Europe, then I mean that Enlightenment in all Western countries, but the process of Enlightenment began from Europe and it spread to all the Western countries. Even Middle East Asia, it spread. So we can consider that. But going historically, the Middle Eastern countries were better in position of scientific knowledge and temper than in comparison to their European counterparts during 17th and 18th century. I substantiate my argument that in lot many Western texts, the mathematical reasoning that flows were considered flowing from the Middle East Asia. But actually, the Middle East Asia was in close companionship with India and China. So Middle East was getting benefited from these two most ancient civilizations, India and China. And by the Middle East was the channel through which the knowledge was transcending towards certain countries. So we need not to look into the aspect of India and India, China, the old and traditional civilizations. Again, I'm repeating this. So there were some characteristics, fundamental characteristics of pre-modernism. Let us look that also. During the pre-modernist time, metaphysical unity of physical existence and principles governing physical existence were considered. Man and society was considered to be the part of divinity. Universal truth was supposed to be ordained by God. Eternal values can be discovered by man within themselves, and they were participants in divine order, not in man-made order, not in any rational order, but were considered to be part of divine order. Man's reason were limited, extremely limited. Faith, the best recourse, was considered for the man to be at peace with universe. So we can see now, with looking to the characteristics, that peoples of pre-modern time before the 17th century were highly under the influence, under the umbrella of God, universal power, energy, supreme energy. So this is the way the pre-modernist people were looking like. After pre-modernism, there was enlightenment. That enlightenment leads towards modernism. Enlightenment in European countries, in Europe during 17th, 18th century, was a departure from pre-modernism and was a slight movement towards modernism. Age of Enlightenment was an intellectual and philosophical movement that dominated the world of ideas. Happened in Europe during 17th and 18th century. It was a 17th century movement which challenged the medieval emphasis on reliance upon faith and belief. Enlightenment is a celebration of man's ability to reason and to think and act rationally, which leads to objective conclusion independent of personal bias and irrational elements like emotion, tradition, social sensitivity. Stressing upon scientific temper, the movement viewed each person as an autonomous individual to be made free from the various meaningless social and religious baggage and made to think and act independently. So it was a kind of a departure. It was not only a departure from pre-modernist time, but it was also a departure from irrationality, social sensitivity, tradition, emotional aspects, and peoples who are moving towards the scientific temper, reasonable and rational thinking, moving with intelligentsia to look the future aspects of the universe and world. And they were also trying to touch the pulses even of law and jurisprudence at that time. Peoples were also getting free from the baggages that they were carrying of faith, that they were carrying of universal power and lot more. A German philosopher, Immanuel Kant was a German philosopher, and he is considered as one of the most important philosophers on enlightenment. He described enlightenment is a man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's own understanding without the guidance of another. This immaturity is self-incurred of its cause, is not lack of understanding, but lack of resolution and courage to use it without the guidance of another. He goes further. He goes further saying that for enlightenment of this kind, all that is needed is freedom. And the freedom in question in modern in caucus and of all freedom to make public use of one's reason in all matter. He considered the motive of enlightenment as to have courage to use own understanding. There could be the situation that people were understanding the things that okay, this is irrational, illogical, unethical. Even after understanding, they were bound and they were compelled to use the pre-modernist principles and live that kind of life. They were not allowed to question the very basic and genesis of the faith, the trust, the faith that they were having in universal power, the supreme existence. But Immanuel Kant take it little differently, and he says that enlightenment was basically to have courage to use own understanding. Means he's emphasizing on that people were having the understanding. We can say that people might be having the understanding in later pre-modernist time, but peoples were not having the courage to utilize their understanding, to speak up their understanding. That is why Emmanuel considers the motto of enlightenment as to have courage to use your own understanding. After pre-modernism, there was a time period of modernism. Modernism was scientific. Modernism is rational. Modernism derives its authority from rational thinking, intelligentsia, intelligible classification. I am not talking intelligible classification in sense of constitutional doctrine evolving from Article 14 of Indian Constitution. I am talking about basic intelligible classification. So modernism emphasized on difference between sacred and secular. This was the first time when people were emphasizing that there is some difference between what is sacred, what is pious, what is pure, what is unchallengeable, and they were also looking something that is secular, that is away from religion, that is at distance from religion. And modernism also inculcated scientific temper. It allowed philosophers to question, to doubt, to challenge, and to confront tradition that they were having. And all this became imaginable and even normal during the phase of modernism, during the phase post-enlightenment, during the time latest 18th century. This all became possible when it is written that it allowed philosophers, that it reflects that people at large were still living their faith, their culture, their traditions. But the source of wisdoms in any country are generally the philosopher. It is said that philosophy, it has been greatly said that philosophical work is a reflection of a society in itself. So the leads come from the the intelligible section of society, which has capability to think on its feet and to think rationally. So it allowed philosophers to question the basic dogmas, fundamental norms, unchallengeable principles. and the faith of people at large. Societal authorities and arrangements were accepted at the stage of modernism because modernism celebrated individual autonomy and independence and considered knowledge objectively, according to some by exercise of human rationality, according to some by empiricism, and according to some by transcendentalism. So people were transcending, the philosophers were transcending the boundaries of their dogmas, the fundamental principles, and they were becoming more scientific. They have better to say moved towards the scientific notion of thinking. They have started asking the questions during the modernist phase. They have started doubting on the principle, fundamental values, and they started taking it rationally. There were less authority of faith over the thinking of philosophers greatly. So man was capable of this objective knowledge, and man-made institutions capable of not only in acting in autonomous and objective manner, but also facilitated human control of secular worlds and thus engendered endless progress. Modernism is a system of thought and regime of knowledge. Modernity refers back and claim to overcome a historical period. Historical period where thinking critically was not allowed. Historical period where during the pre-modernist phase, people were only allowed to think in a box. They were not allowed to think out of the box. But modernist phrase gave permission to that due to enlightenment, basically. So a world of coherent practices which organized around rules, where the rules themselves look their legitimation from a belief in some underlying structure or their inherent functionality, or in terms of their purity. It was cultural and artistic movement as well. Modernism is a range against existing order. The existing order was pre-modernism, which was prevailing for a very longer period of time. We can say from time immemorial. But modernism is a reign against existing order. It is said to exalt the attack on form, the belief that an ability to go beyond, to transcend, to back, to break through it. And even the perhaps the life, they were breaking the fundamental principles, they were challenging, they were questioning the faith and fundamental principles of pre-modernist phrase. So there are some characteristics of modernism as well. We look towards the characteristics of pre-modernism. Now we are supposed to look the characteristic of modernist frame. So during the time of modernism, the philosophers were inculcating scientific temper. They were differentiating between sacred and secular. They were differentiating between religious and rational. The emphasis was given on individual autonomy and independence from external influence. Knowledge was objective. Man-made institutions capable of acting in autonomous and objective manner. Endless progress possible through human control of natural and social world. These are the characteristics of modernism. Philosophers were inculcating scientific temper. They were differing from the opinion of faith and rationality. Individual autonomy was given prevalence. Knowledge was moving towards being objective. The institutions which were made by man were now made capable to act in autonomous manner without even having the authority of God. Before pre-modernist period, during the pre-modern period, everything, each and everything was getting its authority either from a sacred text or from God. Even the sacred text was getting its authority from God. So God was considered supreme, and the command of God was getting represented through the sacred text. But even without the authority of sacred text and God, the institutions which were made by man were now capable to function in an autonomous manner. And this opened the door for endless progress and control of the social world. In this PPT, we can see a small picture that during the post-modern period, human was considered to be connected with God. In modern period, human is considered to be connected with human and getting authority from human as well. Post-modern period is also very mangled, and it is interesting where human is considered to be getting the authority and supremacy from subhuman. So postmodernism was a phrase which was later came than modernism. We went through pre-modernism, we came to modernism, and now we are looking postmodernism. These three phrases that every art, every literature, every sphere of social science could be classified in, could be classification could be done in three stages of evolution of any social science discipline. Postmodernism challenges the basic notion of enlightenment in itself. It began as a movement in architecture in 1950s and 60s by challenging the modernist notions of architecture. Postmodernism, so we can also see that postmodernism is not very old. It is even not 100 years old. It is something that is 70, 75, 80 years old. It is not older than 75 years. So postmodernism is spread into other branches of knowledge like philosophy, literature, and law. Events like Holocaust in Germany, excesses done in USSR and other communist countries for suppression of bourgeoisie, Vietnam War, civil rights movement in USA challenged the humanistic idea of enlightenment that a person was capable of thinking and acting like an autonomous and rational being. Postmodernism challenged the basic principle of modernism, that there is a possibility of gaining objective knowledge by application of scientific approach and temper. So the core of postmodernism was that it challenged the fundamental principle of modernism, and postmodernism does not consider that there is a possibility of gaining objective knowledge by application of a scientific approach and temper, which can be incorporated as universal principle in human institution, making them work in a neutral and independent manner. Postmodernists fundamentally believe that every person has his own thinking based on rationality, every person has his own intelligentsia, and the human institutions are not universal in nature. They are always evolving, always changing, they are extremely dynamic. This is the way postmodernism is looking like, and the scholars of postmodernism, philosophers, consider things to be. There is a difference between modernism and postmodernism. During the time of modernism, knowledge is certain, it is objective and good. During the time of postmodernism, knowledge is not certain, it is not objective, it is neither good. Focus is given on the objective during modernism. In postmodernism, focus is on the image or symbol behind the object. Logocentric reasoning and knowing was given emphasis during modernist time. But during postmodern time, hermeneutic reasoning and communication was given emphasis. There is also contribution of postmodern writers to philosophical thinking and inquiry, which distinguishes it from modernism. So postmodernism is anti-fundamentalist and anti-essentialist. Postmodernism contravenes the modernist ideas of knowledge. It is anti-foundationalist. It challenges the very foundation. The postmodernism challenges the very foundation and essentials, whereas it was not being done during modern time. It does not believe that texts have one static meaning. Modernist philosophers were believing that texts were having modernist philosophers, sorry, I got a call, I apologize for that. Postmodernist philosophers consider that the texts are even not static, whereas modernist philosophers not considering it in that way. The postmodernist philosopher believe that meaning of the text is always shifting, but the modernists were not looking it in this way. So postmodernism is something that is extreme, that has either got directionless or it is turning towards meaninglessness and essencelessness. It is challenging all the fundamental, all the essentials. But it was not something during the modernist time, during the modern phase. During postmodernism, there is a difference to others. The concept of other challenges any fixed and rigidity in text. According to this concept, however fixed we might think meaning of a text is, there is always a possibility of alternative meaning of or the truth, which might be lurking on the margins. This gave birth to different voyages, which challenge the mainstream modernist scholars who tried to ground knowledge on some essential truth. Modernist philosophers were looking for essential truth, whereas the postmodernist philosophers were challenging that very essential truth. There is a very interesting doctrine, death of subject. Death of subject is a doctrine which is which came in postmodern time during discussion. Postmodernism refuses to put person in fixed categories and recognize multiple identities and subjectiveness. Each individual is comprised of multiple subjectiveness and multiple identities as he or she is in society. So, death of subject, this doctrine is that if there is a lady, lady is not just a lady, lady is a housewife, lady is a wife, lady is a mother. If lady is social activist, then with being a lady and all the traits that I just counted, lady would also be social activist. If she is a businesswoman, then she will also be a businesswoman with all the traits, the fundamental of lady. So this is dynamic, this is changing, this is not a static. So this was the very interesting doctrine, death of a subject. There are characteristics of postmodernism. So objective knowledge was not possible in postmodernist thinking. Human understanding embedded in social, cultural, economic, and historical background. Absence of universal truth and principles is one of the most important trait of postmodernism. Accepted truths only, dominant perspectives, principles are different, perspective to issue and facts, concept of others, sensitivity towards perspective of those at the margins, concept of power as circulating in social institutions, some persons oppressor and oppressed in different roles. These are the fundamental principles as it is anti-essentialist. So it is challenging. It is considering that objective knowledge is not possible. Knowledge is dynamic, knowledge is flowing, knowledge is not static. Even the essence of that knowledge, the post-fundamentalist, post-modernist are considered as not static. They are also diverging. They're also considering that there could also be divergence from the essence and meaning of that text by the passage of time. So the fundamental traits are anti-fundamentalist and anti-essentialist of postmodernism and postmodernist philosophers. There is a difference between modernism and postmodernism. Postmodernism rejects theories and try to totalize the reality, whereas modernists believe in all-encompassing grand theory that combines culture, science, and history to explain everything and represents all knowledge. Postmodernists are subjective, modernists are objective. Postmodernists consider that there is no universal truth. Truth is changing. Whereas modernists were believing that there are universal truths that governs the world. Postmodernist During postmodernism, there is irony, there is paradoxy, there is a lack of seriousness and sensitivity in philosophers and thinkers of this time. They are rapidly changing, they are extremely dynamic, they are moving and jumping from one to another as fast as it should not be. Whereas during the modernism, there was a seriousness, there was a directness. During postmodernism, due to jumping from one to another in very rapid manner, there is no depth. There is only superficial appearance. Whereas during the modernism, faith in deeper meaning over superficial appearance. So there was having a deeper meaning, deeper understanding of everything during modernism. Whereas during the postmodernism, the things are superficial. Scholars are not going into the depth of things due to rapid evolving nature. During postmodernism, it rejects focusing on past experience and rejects objective historical truth. During modernism, there was belief in learning from past experience and historical records. So during postmodern time, historical records were not given value that they were actually deserving. Whereas during the modern period, the historical record, the past experiences, the past knowledge were given value, were given some authority sort of. Personally, I consider that postmodernism is a directionless movement, whereas modernism was required at that time.
Pranjal, you need to complete.
This is conclusion.
Okay.
So there is a picture that you can see that during pre-modernism there is a center. No one was allowed to think apart from that focal. During modernism there was a direction, and during post-modernism everything is mismanaged. Everything is mixed in itself. The thoughts, the ideas. Postmodernism, in short, deconstruct the myth created by liberal social, political, and legal regime about the possibility of everlasting rational system of institutions, which would cohere and harmonize the interest of everyone, and which can claim legitimacy because of its inherent justness, morality, and rationality. They point out that one system may be no better in terms of rationality than the alternative system, and existing system originated due to choice made by dominant group, which could be an emotional choice, and thereafter dissenting voices were suppressed. Therefore, legal system is based on violence and continues to conserve itself through violence. There is need to continuously deconstruct the existing order from the perspective of other, that is dissenting voices or those outside the system. This continuous deconstruction and reconstruction can be the only possible approach to justice. Complete justice or just order is something that is unachievable goal, that is something that is to be learned, and that is to be understood by our generation, by the generation of postmodern thinkers. Thank you, ma'am. I'm grateful for this opportunity, and I am also grateful to